The WNBA didn't lose a game. They didn't lose a sponsor. They didn't even lose a player. But the moment NBC opened its mouth, the league lost control of the narrative. Because this wasn't a hot take. This wasn't social media noise. This wasn't a podcast clip designed for clicks. This was a broadcast partner, a company with hundreds of millions of dollars on the line, saying something out loud that the WNBA has spent months trying to keep quiet. NBC didn't just praise Caitlin Clark. They didn't call her exciting. They didn't say she was one of the faces of the game. They called her the most iconic figure in basketball. Not women's basketball. Not college basketball. Not rookies. Basketball. Period. And the reaction wasn't celebration. It wasn't pride. It wasn't relief that women's basketball had finally broken through to the mainstream in a way people have been begging for decades. It was tension. It was discomfort. It was silence where applause should have been. Because that one sentence exposed something far bigger than Caitlin Clark. It exposed a league that doesn't know whether it wants stars or control. It exposed a power struggle between business reality and ideological messaging. And it exposed a truth the WNBA has been fighting all season long, that the rest of the basketball world has already moved on without them. But what made this moment dangerous wasn't just what NBC said. It was who said it, where they said it, and why they felt comfortable saying it now. And once you understand that, everything else starts to make sense. Because this wasn't praise. This was a warning shot. And the fallout from it is only just beginning. But to understand why this hit so hard, you first have to understand what NBC actually represents in this situation, and why their words carry a weight the league can't spin away. NBC isn't a fan account. They're not a blogger. They're not a former player giving an opinion after a bad loss. NBC is a stakeholder. They don't talk unless the numbers already told them the answer. When an executive producer at NBC speaks, they aren't guessing. They aren't speculating. They aren't trying to start a debate. They're communicating a business conclusion. Behind that single sentence is viewership data, minute-by-minute ratings, audience retention curves, advertiser response metrics, social engagement analysis, cross-platform traffic patterns. NBC knows exactly what happens when Caitlin Clark is on screen, and exactly what happens when she isn't. They know how many casual fans tune in for her and disappear without her. They know which highlights travel outside basketball circles. They know which names sponsors ask for in meetings. And that's what makes this different from every other Caitlin Clark debate we've seen. This wasn't an argument. This was an assessment. When NBC called Caitlin Clark the most iconic figure in basketball, they weren't elevating her to make a point. They were explaining reality. And here's the part the league wasn't ready for. NBC said this on an NBA platform. Not a WNBA promo. Not a women's sports segment. An NBA broadcast. That means they weren't comparing her to Alyssa Thomas. They weren't comparing her to Paige Buchers. They weren't comparing her to Angel Reese. They were comparing her to LeBron, Steph, Giannis, Jokic, and saying, right now, she moves the needle more. That's not disrespect. That's not bias. That's not agenda. That's market relevance. And if this were any other league, this would have been treated like a gift. If the NFL's broadcast partner said one player was the most iconic figure in American sports, the league would build an entire season around it. If the NBA heard that about a rookie, they'd flood every promo, every commercial break, every primetime slot with that player's face. But instead of leaning in, the WNBA froze. Because NBC didn't just elevate Caitlin Clark. They shattered the illusion the league has been trying to maintain, that star power doesn't matter more than collective messaging. And that illusion has been the foundation of the WNBA's public positioning all season long. NBC didn't just disagree with it. They ignored it. That's what made this moment so dangerous. Because once a broadcast partner publicly contradicts the league's internal narrative, control shifts. Advertisers listen to NBC, not press releases. Sponsors trust NBC's data, not ideological statements. Casual fans follow NBC's lead, not league talking points. So when NBC spoke, they weren't just talking to viewers. They were talking to everyone with money on the line. And that's why this didn't land as praise inside the league offices. It landed as pressure. Because now the WNBA has to answer a question they've been avoiding for years. If your biggest broadcast partner sees one player as the engine of relevance, why does your own messaging keep pretending she's just another part of the machine? And that's where the cracks really start to show. Because this wasn't the first time the league quietly pushed back against Caitlin Clark's impact. It was just the first time someone with real leverage refused to play along. And once you see how deep that resistance goes, the entire season looks different. But that's where the story takes a sharp turn, because the league's official statements didn't just downplay Caitlin Clark. They actively rewrote why fans were showing up in the first place. And that's where everything begins to unravel. Here's where the disconnect stops being subtle. Because while NBC was looking at numbers, charts, and audience behavior, the WNBA was busy telling a very different story. One that didn't line up with reality, and definitely didn't line up with what fans were actually doing. Throughout the 2024 season, the league made a deliberate choice. Not to ignore Caitlin Clark, not to criticize her, but to reframe the reason fans were watching. And they didn't do it quietly. After the playoffs, the WNBA released official messaging crediting Alyssa Thomas for driving fan interest. Not just in postseason games, but in the regular season. Read that again. The league didn't say multiple players contributed. They didn't say the season benefited from new faces and returning stars. They didn't say Clark was part of a larger movement. They specifically said fans came to watch Alyssa Thomas. Not Caitlin Clark. Not Angel Reese. Not Paige Buchers. Alyssa Thomas. And this wasn't a commentator's opinion. This wasn't a talking head spinning a narrative. This was the league's official position. That's when people started raising eyebrows. Because even among diehard fans, that explanation felt forced. Alyssa Thomas is an elite player, a respected veteran, a cornerstone of her team. But nobody, inside or outside the league, believed she was the reason arenas were suddenly full in cities that had struggled for years. Nobody believed she was driving national TV spikes. Nobody believed she was pulling casual fans off NFL Sundays or NBA nights. And the league knew that. So why say it? Because the messaging wasn't about accuracy. It was about control. The WNBA has spent years positioning itself as a league built on equality. No single star above the collective. No individual larger than the shield. In theory, it sounds noble. In practice, it collides head-on with how sports actually grow. Fans don't fall in love with systems. They fall in love with people. And Caitlin Clark didn't just arrive as another rookie. She arrived as a cultural event. The league saw that and immediately tried to smooth it out. Not because they didn't benefit from it, but because they didn't want the benefit to be attributed to one person. So instead of leaning into the moment, the league tried to redistribute the credit. And that's when the story stopped being about basketball and started being about optics. Because when the WNBA credited Alyssa Thomas for regular season attendance, it wasn't just inaccurate. It was strategic. It was the league signaling that it would rather protect its philosophy than acknowledge reality. And that strategy came with consequences. Fans noticed. Media noticed. Sponsors definitely noticed. Because when your official statements don't match observable behavior, trust erodes. People weren't confused about why they tuned in. They knew exactly why they bought tickets. They knew which highlights they shared. They knew which jerseys sold out. And pretending otherwise didn't convince anyone. It just made the league look uncomfortable with its own success. What made this worse was timing. This messaging came after a season where road attendance spiked whenever Clark's team came to town. After ratings jumped in markets that hadn't cared before. After social media engagement broke records tied directly to her name. The league wasn't unaware of this. They just chose not to center it. And that's the moment the narrative fractured. Because once you publicly credit someone else for momentum that clearly came from one player, you're no longer shaping the story. You're rewriting it. And that's a dangerous game. Especially when your broadcast partner is telling the opposite story to advertisers behind closed doors. That's where NBC's statement becomes even more explosive. Because NBC didn't just disagree with the league. They overruled it. They effectively said, "We see who actually moves the needle, and we're not pretending otherwise." And suddenly, the league's carefully balanced messaging collapsed under the weight of one sentence. Because now fans were forced to ask a question the WNBA didn't want circulating. If Caitlin Clark isn't the reason interest exploded, why does everything spike when she's involved? And once that question is out there, it doesn't go away. Instead of calming tensions, the league's attempt to spread credit made the divide more obvious. It created a visible gap between what people were told and what they experienced. And that gap kept widening. Because this wasn't just about one statement. It was part of a pattern. a pattern of minimizing, redirecting, and softening the impact of a player who was clearly reshaping the league's visibility. And the deeper you look into that pattern, the more uncomfortable it gets. Because it didn't stop at press releases. It extended into media narratives, commentary, and even the way criticism was handled. And that's where the situation really escalated, when defending the message became more important than questioning whether the message made sense at all. Because once you reach that point, facts stop matching. And that's exactly where the next controversy explodes. Because when a single misquote caused outrage, but the underlying claim went untouched, it revealed just how far people were willing to go to protect the narrative. And that's where this story takes a turn that no one could ignore. This is the moment where everything stopped being subtle. Because up until now, you could still argue this was just messaging, just positioning, just the league trying to balance attention. But then the Sheryl Swoopes situation happened, and it exposed how far people were willing to go to protect the story they wanted told. It started with a simple claim. A media report stated that Sheryl Swoopes had suggested Katie Lou Samuelson was more important to the Indiana Fever than Caitlin Clark. That alone should have raised eyebrows. Because the idea that a role player averaging single-digit points provided more value than a rookie breaking scoring records and leading the league in assists wasn't just debatable, it was absurd. But instead of the conversation focusing on how unrealistic that claim was, everything shifted to one thing: the wording. Suddenly, the debate wasn't about whether the statement made sense. It was about whether it had been phrased exactly that way. Swoopes pushed back, saying she meant they were equally important, not that Samuelson was more important. And immediately, the media response kicked in. An apology was issued. Defenses were made. Criticism was reframed as unfair attacks. But here's what never got addressed. Even the clarified version of the statement was still nonsense. Saying Katie Lou Samuelson and Caitlin Clark were equally valuable to the Fever's success made no statistical, competitive, or logical sense. Samuelson averaged just over 4 points per game. Clark averaged nearly 20 points, led the league in assists, broke rookie records, and fundamentally changed how defenses played Indiana. But that comparison wasn't treated as outrageous. Questioning it was. That's when the mask slipped. Because the outrage wasn't about accuracy. It was about defiance. Anyone who challenged the idea that Clark should be flattened into equal importance territory was suddenly framed as the problem. Not because they were wrong, but because they disrupted the narrative. The misquote became the controversy, not the sentiment behind it. That tells you everything. When a league or media ecosystem becomes more focused on protecting how something is said than whether it's true, you're no longer dealing with analysis. You're dealing with ideology. And this ideology had one core rule. No one gets elevated above the collective. Not even if the numbers demand it. Not even if the audience behavior proves it. Not even if broadcast partners confirm it. The defense of Swoopes wasn't really about her. It was about defending the idea that Caitlin Clark's impact could be minimized without consequence. And the apology did something subtle but powerful. It sent a message. It told fans and commentators alike, if you push back on this framing, you're the one out of line. That's a dangerous precedent. Because sports thrive on disagreement. Debate fuels engagement. Truth emerges from friction. But in this case, friction was being smoothed away. Not to clarify reality, but to maintain comfort. And that comfort came at a cost. Because while the media focused on semantics, fans focused on what they were seeing. They saw packed arenas. They saw sold-out road games. They saw viewership spikes. They saw a rookie dominating attention in a way the league hadn't seen before. And being told that this player wasn't uniquely impactful felt insulting to their intelligence. That's when frustration turned into skepticism. Because it wasn't just one comment. It was the accumulation of them. The Fever are better without Caitlin Clark. She doesn't elevate her teammates. Other players are just as important. Each one disconnected from reality. Each one defended harder than it should have been. And the harder they were defended, the clearer the resistance became. This wasn't accidental. It was systemic. A collective decision, spoken or unspoken, that elevating one star too much was a threat to the league's identity. But here's the problem. You can't suppress a star without suppressing momentum. And momentum is fragile. When fans feel like they're being told what to believe instead of shown why, they disengage. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. And that's the most dangerous kind of disengagement. Because it doesn't trend on social media. It doesn't spark outrage threads. It just shows up later, in lower ratings, softer demand, and missed opportunities. And this is where NBC's statement becomes even more significant. Because NBC didn't care about the internal politics. They didn't care about protecting feelings. They cared about results. While others argued over phrasing, NBC looked at outcomes. While apologies were issued, NBC ran the numbers. And those numbers didn't lie. Which is why the next phase of this story isn't about opinions at all. It's about data. Because once you line the numbers up next to the narrative, the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. And that's when the conversation shifts from uncomfortable to undeniable. This is where the conversation stops being subjective. Because opinions can be argued. Intentions can be debated. Messaging can be spun. But numbers? Numbers don't care about ideology. And the deeper you look into the data surrounding Caitlin Clark's arrival, the harder it becomes to defend the idea that her impact was just one part of a bigger picture. Start with attendance. Teams that struggled to fill arenas for years suddenly found themselves sold out, specifically on nights when one player came to town. Not playoff games, not rivalry games, regular season games. Cities that hadn't cracked consistent attendance numbers in seasons were suddenly adding extra seating. Upper decks opened. Standing room tickets released. And it wasn't subtle. The spikes followed a pattern that was impossible to miss. When Clark played, attendance jumped. When she didn't, it normalized. That pattern repeated over and over again, across different markets, different days, different opponents. That's not coincidence. That's demand. Then came television. Games featuring Caitlin Clark didn't just outperform league averages, they redefined them. Viewership didn't rise incrementally. It leaped. Networks saw measurable differences in live viewers, average watch time, replay views, highlight engagement. And those differences weren't marginal. They were decisive. Clark's games pulled in casual viewers, people who didn't follow the league closely, didn't know team rosters, and weren't invested in standings. That's the holy grail in sports. Core fans are loyal. Casual fans are optional. And optional fans only show up when something, or someone, cuts through the noise. Clark did that. Social media told the same story. Clips of her plays traveled far beyond women's basketball circles. They reached NBA fans, college basketball fans, general sports fans. Engagement didn't just increase, it concentrated. Her highlights consistently outperformed league accounts. Her name drove conversations that didn't exist before. And here's the key part people avoid talking about. This attention didn't cannibalize the league. It expanded it. Other players benefited from packed arenas. Other teams gained exposure from national broadcasts. The league saw broader relevance than it had in years. This wasn't a zero-sum moment, but it was treated like one. Instead of acknowledging that one star was pulling the ecosystem forward, the league acted as if spotlighting her would somehow dim everyone else. That's not how attention works. Attention grows outward from focal points. Every major sports boom follows that pattern. Michael Jordan didn't shrink the NBA, he globalized it. LeBron didn't overshadow the league, he sustained it. Steph Curry didn't erase teammates, he elevated the Warriors brand. Stars don't steal attention, they create it. And Caitlin Clark was doing exactly that. The numbers showed it clearly. But acknowledging that would have required a shift in philosophy. It would have meant admitting that equality in visibility isn't the same as equality in value. And that's a line the WNBA wasn't ready to cross. So instead of aligning messaging with data, the data was quietly ignored. Not publicly refuted. Not disproven. Just sidestepped. And that silence spoke volumes. Because when an organization refuses to address obvious trends, it signals discomfort. Not uncertainty. Discomfort. And that discomfort wasn't about Caitlin Clark herself. It was about what she represented. A challenge to the idea that the league could grow without embracing star-driven momentum. NBC saw the trend and responded accordingly. The league saw the same trend and tried to smooth it out. That difference in response explains everything that happened next. Because once numbers start dictating business decisions, ideology loses leverage. And that's when the stakes get real. Because this story stops being about headlines and statements and starts being about survival. Because the moment you ignore the engine driving growth, you risk stalling it. And that brings us to the part of the conversation no one wanted to have publicly. The part where momentum collides with economics. The part where stalled negotiations threaten to shut everything down. Because if the league couldn't align on how to handle its biggest star during a boom, what happens when pressure hits from the other side? That's where the next chapter begins. This is where the story stops being theoretical. Because up until now, the league could argue narratives, messaging, and philosophy. They could debate perception versus intent. They could smooth over tension with carefully worded statements. But then the conversation shifted to something far less flexible. Money, contracts, and whether a season would even happen at all. The CBA negotiations didn't stall overnight. They slowed gradually, quietly, and then all at once. Publicly, everything sounded routine. Productive conversations, continued dialogue, optimism on both sides. But behind the scenes, the math wasn't adding up. The players' union pushed for demands that assumed growth had already stabilized. Long-term revenue, predictable expansion, consistent national viewership. The problem? That growth was still fragile. It was still forming, and it was being driven disproportionately by a moment that hadn't fully matured yet. A moment centered around one player. The league was suddenly in a paradox. They needed Caitlin Clark's momentum to justify future projections, while simultaneously refusing to fully acknowledge that momentum publicly. That's a dangerous place to be, because negotiations don't care about ideology. They care about what exists now, not what might exist if everything goes right. And if a deal couldn't be reached, the consequences weren't abstract. No agreement meant no season. Not a shortened season. Not a delayed tip-off. No season. For most players, that meant what it always has. Overseas leagues. Temporary contracts. Different time zones. Lower visibility in the U.S. It's not glamorous. It's not strategic. It's survival. But for the league as a whole, a lost season would be catastrophic. Momentum doesn't pause. It evaporates. The casual fans who tuned in because something felt fresh don't wait around. They don't follow labor disputes. They don't track negotiations. They move on. And the worst part, the league knows this. They've lived it before. They've spent years fighting for relevance, fighting for airtime, fighting for attention in a crowded sports landscape. And just as the window finally opened, just as people outside the core fanbase started paying attention, the risk of everything grinding to a halt became very real. That's where NBC's perspective becomes even more important. Because NBC isn't just covering the league. They're investing in it. And investments hate uncertainty. A league unsure whether it will even operate next season is not a stable product. Especially not one trying to convert casual viewers into long-term fans. That's why NBC didn't frame Caitlin Clark as a WNBA asset. They framed her as a basketball asset. Something portable. Something adaptable. Something that could survive even if the league stumbled. That's not accidental. That's insurance. And the league felt it. Because while negotiations dragged on, the reality became harder to ignore. If the season doesn't happen, the WNBA doesn't just lose games. It loses timing. It loses cultural relevance at the exact moment it was gaining it. And that loss wouldn't be shared equally. Some players would weather it. Some careers would continue overseas. Some names would still resonate with core fans. But one player stood to lose far more than anyone else. Not in skill. Not in talent. In momentum. Because momentum has a shelf life. And when you're at the center of the conversation, the clock moves faster. That's the part nobody wanted to say out loud. The league could survive a lost season, barely. But the moment they had might not. And once that moment passes, you don't get it back just by resuming play. You have to rebuild interest from scratch. And that leads directly to the most uncomfortable question of all. What happens to Caitlin Clark if the WNBA season doesn't happen at all? Not hypothetically. Not eventually. Right now. Because that answer explains why NBC moved the way they did. And why the league's hesitation suddenly looks a lot more dangerous. This is the part of the conversation people avoid because it feels uncomfortable. Not unfair. Not exaggerated. Uncomfortable. Because Caitlin Clark's risk isn't about talent. Talent survives anything. Her risk is about timing. She is relevant right now not just because she's great, but because she's visible, accessible, and woven into the American sports conversation at the exact moment people are paying attention. That combination is rare. And it's fragile. If the WNBA season doesn't happen, Caitlin Clark doesn't stop being a great basketball player. But she does disappear from the ecosystem that made her a cultural force. Overseas leagues don't preserve momentum. They never have. For decades, Some of the best women's basketball players in the world spent their primes playing in Turkey, Russia, and other international leagues. They were elite. They were dominant. And most American sports fans never saw a second of it. Time zones don't cooperate. Streaming access is clunky. Media coverage is minimal. More importantly, the games aren't part of the daily sports conversation in the U.S. Out of sight becomes out of mind, fast. Caitlin Clark's relevance right now isn't just about box scores. It's about being on national TV, being debated on sports shows, being clipped and shared across platforms, being part of casual conversations that extend beyond basketball fans. Take her out of that environment for a year, and something critical happens. The story moves on. Sports don't wait. There's always another headline, another breakout star, another narrative competing for attention. And when momentum stalls, restarting it isn't automatic. People assume relevance is permanent. It isn't. It's contextual. Clark's rise happened at the intersection of college dominance, media attention, and a league finally ready to capitalize, whether it admits that or not. If she spends a year overseas, she's still incredible. But she's no longer central to the American sports conversation. That's not a judgment. That's reality. And this is where NBC's behavior makes perfect sense. NBC understands momentum windows. They've watched them open and close across every sport they've covered. They know that if Caitlin Clark goes dark for a season, at least from a U.S. audience perspective, the cost isn't measured in points or assists. It's measured in relevance. So they did what smart businesses do. They protected the asset. By integrating her into NBA coverage, NBC ensured that even if the WNBA season stalls, Caitlin Clark remains visible. She stays in the conversation. She stays associated with basketball at the highest level. She stays familiar to casual fans. That move wasn't about disrespecting the league. It was about mitigating risk. And that's the part the WNBA hasn't publicly acknowledged. Because doing so would require admitting that one player carries disproportionate weight right now. And admitting that would force a change in approach. The league has long treated star power as something to be balanced. But in moments like this, balance doesn't preserve momentum. Decisive action does. And the league hesitated. Not because they didn't see the risk, but because embracing it would have meant choosing growth over comfort. And comfort is seductive. It feels safe. It feels fair. It feels principled. But sports don't reward comfort. They reward timing. And Caitlin Clark's timing is now. If that window closes, it won't reopen just because the season resumes. It will reopen when something, or someone, forces it open again. That's why this moment matters so much. Because this isn't about favoritism. It's about stewardship. And right now, NBC is acting like the steward of Caitlin Clark's relevance. While the league debates how to distribute credit, that imbalance is at the heart of this entire conflict. And it leads directly to the most revealing move of all. Because NBC didn't just hedge quietly. They made their priorities visible. And when you look at how they positioned Clark, it tells you exactly where they think the future is headed. By the time Caitlin Clark started appearing inside NBA programming, the message was already clear to anyone paying attention. This wasn't random. This wasn't a one-off appearance. And it definitely wasn't charity. It was positioning. NBC didn't wait for the WNBA to figure things out. They didn't wait for negotiations to resolve. They didn't wait for the league to get comfortable with what was happening. They moved first. By placing Clark within NBA coverage, NBC did something subtle but powerful. They decoupled her relevance from the WNBA's stability. That's a massive shift. Because traditionally, players rise and fall with their leagues. Their exposure is tied to game broadcasts. Their relevance depends on whether the league is active and visible. NBC broke that link. They treated Caitlin Clark not as a league-dependent asset, but as a standalone figure in the sport of basketball. Someone whose voice, analysis, and presence belonged on the same platforms as the biggest names in the game, regardless of gender, league, or current season status. That tells you everything you need to know about how NBC views the situation. They aren't betting on hypotheticals. They're betting on attention. And attention follows people, not institutions. This move served multiple purposes at once. First, it kept Clark visible if the WNBA season stalled. Second, it normalized her presence alongside NBA stars. Third, it signaled to advertisers that NBC would protect the value of its most engaging basketball figure, even if the league couldn't. That's not a vote of confidence in the WNBA's long-term decision-making. That's a contingency plan. And contingency plans exist for one reason: uncertainty. NBC didn't create this uncertainty. They responded to it. They watched a league hesitate to fully embrace its biggest moment while simultaneously risking a shutdown. And instead of waiting to see what happened, they acted in their own interest. Because from NBC's perspective, Caitlin Clark is too valuable to leave exposed. If the season happens, great. She's already embedded in their ecosystem. If it doesn't, they've preserved her relevance anyway. Either way, NBC wins. That's the power shift. The league no longer has exclusive control over its most marketable players' visibility. And that should have been a wake-up call. Because once a broadcaster starts operating independently of a league's narrative, it changes the balance of leverage. The WNBA wants to be seen as the primary steward of women's basketball. But stewardship requires decisiveness. And in this moment, NBC was decisive while the league was hesitant. That contrast didn't go unnoticed. Not by fans. Not by sponsors. Not by other media partners. When NBC positioned Clark alongside NBA stars, they weren't just elevating her. They were redefining the hierarchy. They were saying, this player belongs in the top tier of basketball conversation. Not as a guest. Not as a novelty. As a peer. And that's something the league itself hadn't been willing to say out loud. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If your broadcast partner sees your player as bigger than your league, what does that say about how the league sees itself? Because at some point, refusing to acknowledge reality stops being principled and starts being self-defeating. NBC didn't undermine the WNBA. They exposed its hesitation. And hesitation is deadly in moments of growth. The irony is that this didn't have to be a conflict. The league and NBC could have been aligned. They could have leaned into the moment together. They could have amplified Clark's rise while still celebrating the depth of talent around her. But alignment requires clarity. And clarity requires choosing a direction. So far, the league hasn't. NBC has. And that choice reveals where real confidence lies. Not in carefully balanced statements. Not in defensive messaging. But in decisive action. And that brings us to the core tension driving all of this. Because this isn't really about Caitlin Clark anymore. It's about whether the WNBA is willing to accept how modern sports actually work. Whether they can reconcile their values with reality. Whether they'll embrace a star-driven moment, or let it slip away in the name of comfort. That tension is unavoidable now. And it leads directly to the philosophical crossroads the league can no longer avoid. This is the crossroads the WNBA has been approaching for years, whether they wanted to admit it or not. On one side is the league's core philosophy. Equality. Collective recognition. No single player elevated above the rest. On the other side is the reality of professional sports. Stars drive growth. Stars create moments. Stars pull casual fans into ecosystems they would otherwise ignore. Both ideas sound reasonable on their own. The problem is, they don't coexist easily. The WNBA has always leaned heavily on the first. It's part of the league's identity. Part of how it differentiates itself. But Caitlin Clark's rise forced a confrontation with the second. Because her impact wasn't theoretical. It wasn't projected. It was happening in real time. And instead of adapting, the league hesitated. They tried to walk a tightrope, acknowledging her presence without fully embracing her dominance. They wanted the benefits without the implications. But sports don't work that way. You can't ask fans to feel something and then tell them not to notice why they feel it. Equality in opportunity doesn't mean equality in influence. Every major league understands this, because they've lived through it. The NBA didn't become global by treating every player the same. It became global by leaning into stars and letting their gravity pull the league forward. The NFL doesn't pretend quarterbacks aren't more valuable. They build the entire product around them. No one argues that offensive linemen deserve equal marketing exposure. Not because they aren't important, but because visibility follows influence. That doesn't erase teamwork. It amplifies it. And that's the distinction the WNBA has struggled with. They've treated star elevation as a moral dilemma instead of a growth strategy. As if acknowledging one player's outsized impact somehow invalidates everyone else. It doesn't. It lifts the entire platform. But embracing that truth would require a shift in identity. It would require the league to say, we believe in equality, but we also understand how attention works. That sentence has been hard to say out loud. because it feels like compromise. But refusing to compromise has its own cost. It leads to moments like this, where a broadcast partner speaks more clearly about a league's biggest star than the league itself does, where fans feel like their enthusiasm is being managed instead of celebrated, where momentum exists but isn't fully captured. And the longer that tension lasts, the harder it becomes to resolve. Because eventually you have to choose. You can be the league that insists no one is bigger than the system, or you can be the league that understands systems grow faster when stars lead the way. You can't be both. Caitlin Clark didn't create this conflict. She exposed it. Her rise forced the league to confront a question it had been able to avoid for years. And avoidance only works until reality demands an answer. The WNBA is at that point now. Because the window that's open won't stay open forever. Casual fans won't wait for philosophical clarity. Sponsors won't invest in hesitation. Broadcast partners won't pause momentum to accommodate discomfort. They'll move forward, with or without alignment. And that's what makes this moment so critical. This isn't about choosing sides. It's about choosing direction. And whether the league recognizes it or not, that choice is already being made around them. Because while the WNBA debates identity, the world keeps watching what actually happens next. And that brings us to the final pressure point. The moment that decides whether this era becomes a foundation or a missed opportunity. Moments like this don't announce when they're ending. They don't come with countdown clocks or warning lights. They just move on. The WNBA is in the middle of one of those moments right now. Interest from outside the core fanbase. Mainstream sports conversation. Casual viewers tuning in without being asked. That combination is rare. And it's temporary. Casual fans are curious, not committed. They don't follow league politics. They don't track labor negotiations. They respond to momentum. Right now, momentum exists, but it's uneven. It spikes around one player. It flattens when that player isn't involved. That's not a criticism. It's a diagnostic. And diagnostics only help if you're willing to act on them. The danger isn't that the league has a star. The danger is treating that star like a phase instead of a foundation. Because once curiosity fades, it doesn't come back easily. You don't just pick up where you left off. Attention moves on to the next story, the next face, the next breakthrough. And rebuilding interest is always harder than sustaining it. The WNBA has seen this cycle before. Years of steady progress followed by plateaus. Moments of visibility followed by long rebuilds. What's different now is scale. This moment is bigger. The spotlight is brighter. And the consequences of hesitation are heavier. Because Caitlin Clark isn't just another talented player. She's a cultural connector. She links college fans to the pro game. She pulls in viewers who don't usually watch women's basketball. She creates entry points. That kind of influence is time-sensitive. It relies on familiarity, on repetition, on presence. Remove her from the spotlight, even temporarily, and the connection weakens. And if the league doesn't fully capitalize while the window is open, someone else will. Media partners already are. They're shaping narratives. They're defining relevance. They're deciding where attention flows. And once those decisions harden, it's difficult to reverse them. The league doesn't lose power all at once. It leaks it, a little at a time, through hesitation, through diluted messaging, through missed alignment. And by the time the damage is visible, the moment has already passed. That's the risk the WNBA faces right now. Not collapse. Stagnation. The kind that looks stable on paper but feels flat to fans. The kind where numbers stop growing. Not because people are angry, but because they're indifferent. Indifference is the real enemy. And indifference is what happens when momentum isn't nurtured. The window is open, but it's not patient. It won't wait for perfect solutions or unanimous agreement. It closes quietly. And that brings us to the final question. Not about Caitlin Clark, not about NBC, but about the league itself. What does the WNBA actually want to be? Because the answer to that question determines whether this era becomes a turning point or a footnote. At the center of all this isn't a player. It's a decision the WNBA has delayed for years, but can't delay anymore. Do you want to be right, or do you want to be relevant? Because right now, the league is trying to be both. And that's the problem. NBC didn't create Caitlin Clark's influence. They measured it. They didn't exaggerate her importance. They acknowledged it. And in doing so, they forced the league to confront a reality it's been uncomfortable with since the moment Clark entered the conversation. This isn't about favoritism. It isn't about disrespecting other players. And it definitely isn't about erasing teamwork. It's about understanding how modern sports actually work. Stars don't shrink leagues. They expand them. They bring in new fans, new money, new attention, and everyone benefits if the moment is handled correctly. The NBA learned that decades ago. The NFL operates on it every season. Global sports have been built on it for generations. The WNBA has that moment now. And instead of grabbing it with both hands, it's hesitating, trying to smooth the edges, trying to spread credit evenly, trying not to offend anyone. But growth isn't polite. It's decisive. And every day the league waits, the window narrows. NBC saw the urgency and moved. They protected relevance. They protected momentum. And in doing so, they exposed the real controversy. Not that Caitlin Clark was called the most iconic figure in basketball, but that the league she plays for still isn't sure how to respond to that fact. The choice is simple, even if the consequences aren't. You can build around a transcendent star and let the entire league rise with her. Or you can protect an ideal and hope momentum doesn't slip away while you debate it. History tells us which approach works, and the clock is already ticking. So the real question isn't whether NBC was right. It's whether the WNBA is ready to act before this moment becomes something people talk about in the past tense. If you want to stay ahead of where this story is actually going, not where the press releases point you, hit subscribe. Because this isn't ending with one statement, one season, or one negotiation. The decisions being made right now will shape the league for years. And when the next move happens, you'll want to understand why it happened before everyone else catches up. Subscribe and stay sharp.